I will talk on the Four Noble Truths. How to develop mindfulness, cultivate mindfulness on the Four Noble Truths, which is the subject under Dhammanupassana, reality objects. So this is one of the objects for cultivation in the Satipatthana Sutta, the great discourse on meditation by the Buddha. And monks, what is the noble truth of suffering? Now the first truth is suffering. Suffering or unsatisfactoriness, dukkha in Pali. So in this sense, it is translated as suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering. Grief, lamentation, pain, sadness, and despair are sufferings. Being attached to the unloved is suffering. Separated from the love is suffering. Not getting what one desire is suffering. In short, the 5 aggregates of cleaning are suffering. So suffering explained in 12 ways in this discourse, in this practice. So, to develop mindfulness on suffering. So, what is suffering? What is suffering? So, Buddha say birth is suffering. Now, why is birth suffering? Explain in other section of the discourse that a child being in the mother's womb for 10 months is a lot of suffering. So very cramped inside, it's warm, it's hot, it's watery, and cannot move. And when the child is born, it is squeezed out. So there's a lot of pain in the child when it's being squeezed out of the stomach to the coming outside. And of course, when a child is born, child has to breathe oxygen. So normally he has to cry out of pain or else make to cry so that he breathes. Aging is suffering. Now why is aging suffering? Buddha say decaying of the senses, having blurred vision, cannot see well, hardness in hearing, insensitive to taste, mental decay such as dementia, forgetfulness, loss of memories. So these are the suffering of aging when a person grows old. The eyesight isn't too good, it's not longer sharp. It's blur, cannot focus well. And of course, forgetfulness is a terrible thing. Just imagine, can't remember your loved ones, or even your own house. You could read in a paper that they go out walking and they forget to come home because they can't recognize the house. So imagine, can't even recognize your loved ones. So memories is lost. They have no past at all, no past. So that's probably very frightful, aging. And of course, sicknesses. Old age comes with sicknesses. You have rheumatism, your whole body has pain, and too much air, I suppose. Air element, too much air element. Diabetes, high blood, low blood, heart diseases, cancers, and many others. These cause a lot of pain. Now, these are a lot of suffering. But these are realities. These are nature of birth. Comes with decay, old age, and death. And Then what about dying? And death, dying. Well, dying also produces a lot of pain due to attachment to loved ones. When one wonders what will happen to my children, what will happen to my grandchildren, my parents, my loved ones, and so forth. Or attachment to property, what we have gained, work so hard for it, what will happen to the property? Will it be lost? Will my children not able to manage it? Or so forth. And fear of oneself too. Is it very painful in dying? Now these are the question, or is the question that I often ask to me. Is it painful to die when we are dying? Is it very painful when we can't breathe and we are grasping for breath? Perhaps there are those who ask, Brother James, what happened when they burn my body? Will I feel the pain? So they have fear, and they say that when I die, surely I will not have my body burned. So they have fear that even when dead, they fear that they experience pain. Where will I be? Will I then suffer in my next life? And so forth, and so forth, and so forth. So there is again fear in dying. Now, why? Why must there be fear in dying? Why? Why must there be so much suffering? So, a lot of time, people do not want to see suffering, perceive suffering. They sort of try to avoid suffering, right? Try to ignore, try not to see them. But meditators need to cultivate mindfulness of suffering in its various forms of suffering. Now why? Why do Buddha teach us that we need to develop, cultivate this mindfulness, mindfulness as suffering as an object? What is the purpose? Now, when we cultivate this mindfulness of seeing suffering as an object, mindfulness always arises with detachment. The mind arises with detachment and mental balance. Then you start to see suffering as an object. Now, if you don't see suffering as an object, then the mind tends to hold on to suffering. The mind don't see it as an object. It hold on, meaning to say it produces fear. When you see somebody suffering, see your loved one suffering, see your friend suffering, see your friend pass away, there arises in the mind great fear, because as it happens to others, it will happen to you one of these days. So fear arises when suffering is not developed as an object of observation, but as a form of attachment. When you see such object, fear arises. When you see people getting sick, there's a fear in our mind that we too will grow old, will be diseases, will die. So there are those who refuse to see that. One day I was with a friend in a car, and we were traveling along Jelotong in Penang, going down to Penang Road. We are supposed to meet someone. And suddenly he make a U-turn, very fast U-turn, and really give me a fright. He said, "Hey, what are you doing?" He said, "Oh, there's this dead possession coming, heading our way towards us. So I don't want to see that." So I say, "Why? What happened?" He says, "Bad luck. You see, people die, very bad luck." So then what has that to do with luck? I asked him. People die. It's a natural process. When there is birth, there is death. It's two ends of a coin. And what has luck to do with seeing people dying? So he has fear because he do not want to see death. It reminds him of himself that one day he too will die and he doesn't want to die. Right? So, why is it so? Because of fear, because of attachment. That it happened to someone, it will happen to me. Therefore, fear arises in him. But if a meditator practices this awareness, this mindfulness, and habitually takes suffering as an object, and when suffering becomes strong, detachment becomes strong, and mental balance becomes strong, then a meditator will then lead a meditator to the next noble truth. What is the cause of this suffering? There is a second noble truth arising in the mind. A meditator then will search for the cause. Why? Why is there so much suffering? So, a meditator then will focus on the cause of suffering. Otherwise, normally, people will try to ignore, try to stay away from seeing. People do not want to go to hospital, does not want to see people, sick people. Because if you go to the hospital, you see people, sick people lying there, groaning, wailing, lamentation. One day, a dear one was in hospital and the next to bed, there was this patient there, sighing all the time. And my close relative was saying, I can't sleep the whole night because they are wailing the whole night. They're sighing the whole night with pain. So people do not like to go to hospital because there are so much suffering. Destroy their peace of mind. Destroy their hallucination. They want to see only happiness. They want to see only good things. What is good in seeing suffering? They would ask this question. Why must we see suffering? It reminds us of a lot of unpleasant things. But only by recognizing, the wisdom arises by recognizing that there is this suffering in life because it is a noble truth, which the Buddha says, what is birth? The birth of the appearing of beings in all dimensions, in the Deva world, in the human world, in the animal world, insects world, in the underworld. Birth, old age, decaying, and they pass away. Every beings, when the body decays and wither away, then the disappearing of the beings, and that is the passing away. Whether high or low, it is this reality. It is the signs of suffering. Now only when a meditator develops mindfulness, and when the mindfulness is strong, then he can see suffering clearly. Otherwise, if the craving, sometimes we do see suffering in a gross form. We do see people in pain, but then we forgot about it as we walk out of the hospital, as we leave the house. The friend who is sick, you visit him, and when you leave the house, you forget about their suffering because craving takes over. Ill will takes over the mind. Infatuation takes over the mind. We call it hallucination or fantasy. You believe that, it will not happen to me. It happened to him because he's old, but I'm still young. It will not happen to me. It is called fantasy of mind or moha citta, avijja. Moha citta means fantasy of mind or hallucination, that it will never happen to me. It can only happen to somebody else. It is a world of make-believe, like an ostrich. Put his head inside the sand, deep dark inside, open his eyes, and he says, I'm safe because everything is dark and nobody see me. Because he can't see anybody does not mean that people can't see him. Because his head is only in the ground, but his body is outside the ground. People can still see him. Now, fantasy, people living in hallucination or avijja, refusing to see. Refusing to see will not lead one out of suffering. Now, It brings one into fantasy, leave one to craving, to cleaning, and brings one to action becoming. We run away, we avoid, we do other things to fulfill our senses, to make ourselves happy so that we can forget about all these things called suffering. So we avoid suffering. Try not to believe that there is suffering. But that does not lead us to investigate Dhamma Vichaya into the cause of suffering, the second noble truth. What really happens? Only when you go into investigation on the second truth, knowing its cause of suffering, then the meditator let go of suffering. Once the meditator let go of craving, the Buddha says, that very craving attachment that produces pain, once the mind let go of it, then there is realization, there is the freedom of suffering. Then it goes to the third noble truth. The meditator then experiences the bliss of letting go, because there is no more suffering. When the mind does not attach to pain, just as when you meditate and you see pain, you see numbness, you see hot and cold in your body. But once you are mindful, your mindfulness is strong, concentration is strong, and you focus into the pain. When the mind is detached, you only see pain as an object. Pain does not disturb the mind. Why does pain not disturb the mind? Because of strong mindfulness. Mindfulness, when it is developed, the mind detaches from pain. In Pali, we say, alobha cetasikas. The detachment mental states is being developed. Every time we practice meditation, every time we see object as object, the mind detaches from the objects. The more the mind detaches from the object, the clearer is the object. Just as when the mind detached from the painful feeling, you could see painful feeling in various forms. You could see painful feeling as jumping, as poking, as cutting, as hardness, as cold, as warm. You could see feeling in many other ways and forms without being affected by that suffering, that painful feeling, because of mindfulness and detachment. Now this is exactly what you apply when you do it in the Four Noble Truths. You apply the same technique that you are practicing now. You need not be aware of it, that you're just sitting there, rising, falling. And you say, Brother James, I've been practicing so long, I don't feel anything different in me. I don't see any color. I don't see any devas. Now, you do not need to see devas and color and so forth. Yes, this rising and falling, rising, falling. These mental states develop. And when it is developed, the enlightenment comes in various ways. When these 7 factors of enlightenment are matured, enlightenment manifests in many ways. The mind let go, detaches from the object. Only when this mind detaches from this suffering can we be free from suffering. Otherwise, we have these fantasies of happiness. The mind only sees happiness because the Buddha says the object has its nature of pleasantness. The object is pleasant. The contact to this object is pleasant. The seeing of this pleasant object is pleasant. So this craving arises with this fantasy that this world is joyful, it is happiness. And because it is happiness, the mind craves for more and not letting go. And so, therefore, suffering arises because it is not enduring. Because happiness, the object keep changing, contact changing, the seeing keep changing, hearing keep changing, contact changing, the hearing consciousness keep changing. And when it is always changing, the mind always cling and renew the happiness. And this process of renewing or holding on to happiness produces a lot of stress to the mind, a lot of tension to the mind, a lot of grieving to the mind that give rise to dissatisfaction. A lot of things that we crave for that is not realized or cannot be realized or is not realized now. What we want now, we cannot get it now. It is delayed. Maybe later you get it, but we want it now. But now you can't get it. So it produces a lot of suffering to the mind. The mind becomes depressed. Mind becomes agitated. Mind becomes angry. Mind becomes stressful. Mind becomes restless. Now these are the suffering of the mind. Then arises this suffering. And the cause of suffering is this attachment. Wanting something you can't have now. You want it now, not tomorrow, not next year. Want it now. Now I want to see. Now I want to hear. Now I want to smell. Now I want to taste. Now I want to touch. Now I want to think I am successful. Everything goes according to plan and everything is smooth. No obstruction, no disruption. A lot of time, things doesn't happen this way. Takes a lot of time to build up what you want. And in the process, there's a lot of grieving, a lot of stress, a lot of longing and false hope and failure along the way. So, when one train the mind with awareness to see dukkha, to see suffering, it builds up a lot of wisdom. And the mind slowly gains a lot of wisdom as the mind perceives the nature of constant changing. When there is this beginning, there must be this ending. When there is this birth, there must be this continuation of growth and decay and passing away. Now that is called the inner wisdom. And the gross form of wisdom, the two types of right understanding, the basic beginning of right understanding and the fulfillment, the deep realization of right understanding. The first aspect of seeing the nature that there is so much suffering around us. Not only is there happiness, but there is abundance of suffering that comes, the opposite side of the coin. And normally, happiness leads to pain. Whenever you hold on to suffering, whenever you hold on to happiness, you are also holding on to suffering, because they come together, not one without the other. They always come together like a horse and a carriage. The horse comes first and it pulls, the carriage follows behind. So why must we cultivate mindfulness on suffering? Because it is important to build up our mindfulness to see things as they really are. The first noble truth of this mind and body, internally, externally, of the outside mind and body, they are subject to suffering. They are incomplete. They are unsatisfactory. They are not 100%. They are not complete. They are not 100% because they are subject to suffering. There's no 100% happiness internally, externally, because it changes all the time. Now, if one develops this mindfulness, then the detachment arises with this mindfulness. Always remember that whenever you are mindful, detachment arises with mindfulness. When you do dana, when you do giving, there is this detachment in the mind. This is mindfulness that this is wholesome to do. And when there is detachment arises in the mind, then you give. If there is no detachment arises in your mind, you will not give. If you think it is good to give, but then the craving arises after that thought, and the craving says, but I don't have enough to give, then you would not give. Because when there is craving in the mind, there is no detachment. When there is no detachment, the mindfulness has passed away, subside. So at that moment, there is no mindfulness, there is no detachment. So therefore, that person can't give at that moment. Even though in the beginning, he thinks he wants to give. But when the craving arises, follow up, he can't give because there is no detachment. So mindfulness always arises with detachment of mind and also balance of mind. Mind is balanced, detached, mindful, then he sees the object clearly. And it's important to build up this perception of suffering, the first noble truth. Why is it so? Because when the meditator perceives suffering, the noble truth of suffering, birth is suffering, old age is suffering, disease is suffering, dying is suffering, nobody can get out of this suffering by belief, by praying, by begging, or by money, or whatever, by begging, because it is the noble truth. It is reality. So one Dhammanupassana, the meditator is practicing mindfulness of seeing reality. And what is this first reality? That is surrounding us, outside and inside and everywhere in the 31 plane of existence. There is this reality, the reality of suffering. Only when it becomes strong, this perception of suffering becomes strong, then the mind will lead to searching for the cause of suffering. Why must there be suffering? What is the reason for the arising of suffering? And the mind goes towards the second truth of suffering. Then again, if there is no mindfulness, arises with detachment and non-ill will, because there is always, when there is detachment, it also arises with non-ill will. In Pali we say adosa cetasikas, non-ill will. The mind is not disturbed. Now whenever you see the suffering, externally or internally, and your mind is disturbed, that a meditator knows that he is not seeing things as they really are. He is not practicing the Four Noble Truths. He is not seeing suffering as an object with detachment, but he is absorbed into suffering. Whenever there is arising suffering in the mind of a meditator, by perceiving old age, disease, suffering, sicknesses, and death, you feel uncomfortable, you feel disturbed, you feel annoyed, you feel depressed, you feel sad, then you know for sure you have not developed that mindfulness. It's not strong enough. to penetrate into the Four Noble Truths. In other words, when there is this realization, there is this Four Noble Truths. The Buddha's teaching in the Tipitaka, the three baskets, when it is stacked up, it is the height of the height of three elephants. But it is all summarized into this discourse on the Four Noble Truths. Simply said, a Buddha is born to teach the Four Noble Truths. The sole purpose of the birth of a Sammasambuddha is to teach the Four Noble Truths, so that there are those who are able to practice the Four Noble Truths and therefore escape from suffering, the round of birth and death. Now, as long as our mind do not realize this Four Noble Truths, there will be constant pain and suffering, not only in this life, but birth in the future life. Now, that is where the dependent origination, the teaching of dependent origination taught by the Buddha, suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, the way out of suffering. And I will go through that as I slowly explain the Four Noble Truths. And I will also explain birth in the 19 ways of thoughts that give rise to rebirth in the 31 plane of existence. Now, this constant birth of suffering, there are 19 types of mind that take birth. In Pali, we say patisandi citta, that take birth, that continues into the 31 planes of existence. I'll come to that later on in the Four Noble Truths. And when mindfulness is developed and becomes strong, the detachment mental state becomes strong, and the mind perceives clearly the truth of suffering. The first truth of suffering, that is the two types of right understanding, the apparent understanding and the insight understanding. So, ignoring the truth, thinking it will not happen to me, or living in denial, or it can't happen to me, will not lead to the end of suffering. Only when the mind perceives the truth of suffering, there is this urgency to find the cause or the arising of suffering. Then arises the samveka. My teacher always say that. It takes me a long time to understand this word samveka. He's a Thai, and he can't speak English. He has no Hokkien word. And so he says, samveka. Say, Long Paul, what is this samveka? I can't find in the dictionary. And later, after many months, I find this word, this translation, samveka. Urgency to practice. Urgency. When a person get burnt, there's an urgency to find the ointment, and so that when you put into your burnt area, it will not burn. It cools down the burn. There's urgency. Where's the medicine? Where's the medicine? I need that to put on my burned hand. Urgency, samveka. Only when we come face to face with suffering, arises this urgency to find a way out of suffering. And how do you do that? Do that by force, because you experience so much pain. Second way, by way of mindfulness. Mindfulness, see the noble truth clearly of suffering, but the other one do not see the first noble truth of suffering clearly. The other one is experiencing suffering, but he does not perceive clearly. That is the difference between both. Those who practice mindfulness and those who experience suffering, but not developing strong mindfulness. Is there a difference? Yes. The one with mindfulness will get into realization faster than those who have not developed that mindfulness, because he has to start from the base again. He has to start with the base. It's easier for those with mindfulness to proceed on to the next truth than those who merely experience but have not established mindfulness. So he has to start establishing. But it gives him the motion. So Buddha says, there are times suffering leads to an urgency. Urgency leads to the freedom of pain. So the Buddha says that sometimes it is good to suffer. If one lives in blissful denial, one has a lot of happiness all the time, there is no need to find the truth of suffering, because he does not suffer. You ask him, are you suffering? No, I am not suffering. I have so much happiness. I have so many houses. I have so many cars. I have so many children and grandchildren. I have so much money in the bank. I am not suffering. So, he does not see suffering. He is indulged in a lot of happiness, craving, enjoying senses. So therefore, the first noble truth does not appear in his perception, because he has not developed that mindfulness. So, the suffering, painful, unpleasant objects become merely an object of observation, like a scientist merely observe the disease through the microscope, calm, undisturbed, with that knowing mind. Now just as you practice, just as a scientist would observe the disease. Now meditator practice the same way as merely observing suffering, but not attached to suffering. The moment you are attached to suffering, then you yourself suffer. You must remember that. You must look at suffering as merely suffering, as a noble truth. Now that is the importance of the training. To know whether mindfulness is there or not, you must ask yourself, is there suffering in my mind? But if you experience suffering in your mind, then you know mindfulness is not there. Instead of practicing mindfulness in watching suffering, you are attached to suffering. How are you attached to suffering? When you see your loved one suffer, then you suffer. That is called attaching to suffering. You attach to your loved one who is suffering, so therefore you also suffering. Then you know that this is suffering, the nature of birth. There is diseases, old age and death. And so you detach your mind. And how you detach your mind? You keep noting the object, suffering, suffering, suffering. Now if you don't use words in your mind to act as a buffer, the mind gets swallowed in very fast. And once the mind get into suffering, and when your loved one suffer, at once you suffer. When your loved one is sick, at once you are mentally sick. When a loved one is suffering, you suffer intense pain and wailing and lamentation. The Buddha say, intense pain. Not only suffering, but intense suffering. Lamentation, pain, grief, despair. Intense suffering. Then again, living in ignorance, not knowing, does not lead to the second truth, the cause of suffering. If one live a life of ignorance, who is not a Buddhist, does not understand the Four Noble Truths, does not practice mindfulness with regard to the Four Noble Truths, then there is samsara, the wheel of birth and death. He has not learned that lesson of truth. He has to come back again and again and again until he has finished his work in this life. There is this purpose of us being here because we have not finished our lesson. We have not seen the truth, Four Noble Truths. And if we don't learn in this life, we will need to learn the next life, the next life, the next life. The second truth, the second noble truth, the origin of suffering or the arising of suffering, the first cause of arising of suffering, the beginning of suffering. Now you read all these things in a lot of writers. They use one of these terms. And, O monks, what is this noble truth of the origin of suffering? Asked the Buddha. This is the craving leading to rebirth, the birth and death in samsara, in various places of existence and form. This is the cause of suffering. So next week, I have gone through the three types of suffering, but there are more. The Buddha, in short, Buddha note here in the practice of Satipatthana, Buddha mentioned the 11 types of suffering. Perhaps I go through a bit more and come to the second noble truth, the cause of suffering. Alright, see you next week. May you all be well, peaceful and happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.